Hello and welcome. I'm Julia Caron. I make radio here in Quebec City, and today I'm here to introduce you to and speak with Juliette Bernatchez and Megan Bradbury, who are joining us live from their respective cities of literature. This exchange is made possible by the UNESCO City of Literature program. This is a virtual residency exchange, which has been taking place over the course of the summer of 2002 and the fall. And now we're at this stage of the residency where we get to meet each other and talk about what we've written and what this residency has made for their creative writing styles. And it's a wonderful opportunity to meet you. I'm just going to make sure we thank the people who made this possible. The City of Québec, l'entente de développement culturel from the City of Québec, funding from the province of Quebec, as well as the National Centre for Writing and the Bureau du Québec à Londres. So without further ado, let's introduce ourselves. Megan, let's start with you. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and where you are this morning?
So I'm in Dragon Hall, which is where the National Centre for Writing is based in Norwich, England. I live in Norwich, so I'm about 20 minutes walk from here, which is very convenient. I'm primarily a novelist, but I've worked on commissions and collaborations with artists from different disciplines for a number of years. I'm also a tutor and a creative writing mentor here in Norwich. I have one novel published, and I'm working on my second novel. I'm very happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
And Juliette, let's go to you.
Oui, je suis Juliette Bernatchez. Je suis présentement dans la Maison de la littérature, donc je suis à la bibliothèque, dans l'espace bibliothèque. Je suis travailleuse culturelle et autrice. Je travaille principalement avec des organismes culturels et littéraires de la Ville de Québec. Je suis aussi, j'essaie de plus en plus d'asseoir ma pratique de créatrice. Donc, cette première résidence, ça a été vraiment un très beau tremplin pour moi. Puis, ça m'a permis de découvrir plein de choses sur ma pratique. Donc, je suis très heureuse d'être ici. Merci.
Thank you both for making time to be here. And it's great to be able to speak from these two locations. Here this morning in Quebec City, it is snowy. It's a beautiful winter day. And we are in the Maison de la Littérature, which we will talk about a bit in writing. But Megan, I'm wondering if you could begin by telling us about where you are right now, the physical building, and what you know about the history of the place where you're at this morning.
Oh, I should really know all the facts by now, because Dragon Hall is such a part of my kind of daily life here in Norwich, and for many people here in Norwich. So I'm in a medieval hall here. As you can see, it's an absolutely huge room that I'm in. This is kind of if you can imagine, kind of a medieval banqueting hall. That's what it is. This is where the Dragon Hall and the Writer Centre hold many of their events. So they'll have lots of book launches here and discussions and talks. So it really is the cultural centre of Norwich. This is where people come for salons and discussions, lots of school groups and things. So it really is the heart of cultural life here in Norwich. We're positioned on King Street, which is by the river. And it's sort of tucked away on the edges of the city centre of Norwich. We don't have snow, unfortunately. It's a very typical kind of Norwich winter's day, which is very cold, but no kind of like winter loveliness, I'm afraid. The National Centre for Writing is, as I said, it's a really important institution here in Norwich, supporting local writers, but also for events, for cultural exchange. So there is the events space here, but there's also the offices which deal with lots of the administration of different events that happen in and around the city, and nationally, because it's a national centre. I won't give you dates, because I really would get them wrong. But it's the kind of place, and I'm sure this is true of many locations in Quebec. When the building was restored, a lot of effort was gone into maintaining the history of the place. So you can see kind of bits of etchings in the wood and kind of marks and sort of fingerprints of previous generations who have kind of lived and worked in this building. So it's really beautifully restored. and I think that's quite a testament to Norwich generally as a place that really respects its history, but kind of wears it in a very, I'd say, sort of sophisticated way. It's a kind of a demure presentation of history, I think. So Norwich is fantastic for that, and it's been interesting during this project to see how far Quebec is also similar, treats its history in a similar way. Yeah, I won't give you dates though, because I will get that right. look on the Dragon Hall website for a full history.
And there are beautiful photos on the Dragon Hall website of just the remarkable space you're in. And Juliette, you and I are both in the Maison de la Littérature in Quebec City. We're in the walled city. We're in what we call Vieux Québec, or the old Quebec, the part of the city. Juliette, do you want to tell us a bit about the Maison de la Littérature and how it was once a church and has been a library and a space for gathering since 2015, I believe?
Oui, c'était la date que je connaissais en plus. Donc, oui, la Maison de la littérature, c'était en fait, il me semble, le temple Wesley à l'époque. Donc, elle a été reconvertie en 2015. Elle est sous la protection, je dirais, de l'Institut canadien de Québec. Puis, c'est une bibliothèque. Ça abrite donc un espace bibliothèque, mais aussi une scène culturelle dans son premier étage. Donc, il y a plusieurs spectacles qui ont lieu ici, plusieurs activités de création. Il y a bien sûr la bibliothèque, mais aussi tous les espaces de création qui sont disponibles. Il y a un studio de création, entre autres, une résidence qui abrite des auteurs-autrices de partout dans le monde. Donc, c'est vraiment intéressant comme façon de créer. Donc, voilà, c'est ce que je dirais de la Maison de la littérature. C'est aussi un lieu de rassemblement, je dirais, là, tant du milieu culturel littéraire que pour les, les citoyens de la ville.
The reason I wanted to start by asking you both about the locations where you're at is place is so key in what you have written, what you wrote in the summer as you started your residency, and what we're here to discuss today. And location becomes really a part of the story, these spaces imbued with history, but also personal memories. Megan, I'm wondering if I could start with you with the tour you take us on in your text Revelation and some of the streets and locations that you take us to.
Yeah, so this has been a really fun part of the project because it's not something I've done before. And when I was thinking about my proposal for this project, it surprised me actually that I've not been active in writing about the place where I live. And I think with lots of artists will probably feel similarly that the place that they're in, quite often you need to be introduced to it through other means. It's so easy to get used to where you live, particularly in the city of Norwich, which is where I predominantly grew up. So it's a place I know very well. So what I wanted to do from the outset was to try and look at the city with Juliette's eyes almost, be her guide, but also using kind of her newness to the city as a way to think about the city in a new way. So I wanted to, from the beginning, and we talked about this before we kind of got on with the research for the project, is to take Juliette on some of the walks that would be helpful for the history of her project, for her research, but also introduce her to kind of more sort of daily routes that I take. So in the story, so some of these routes I included in the story, and some of them I cut out in the end. But the main one is one that runs. I wanted to include as part of the story not just the sort of typically historical and very beautiful locations, of which there are many in Norwich, but also kind of the utilitarian commerce areas. So first of all, took her to the very glamorous underpass at the top of St Stephen's Road, which is a roundabout, and you go through the underpass, you go down St Stephen's Street, which is a shopping street built predominantly in the 60s. So the architecture is from that era. And it became very clear to me that actually wherever I walked in the city, there would be places associated with my past because I grew up here. And so I thought, well, as this is true, I'll include some of these details, and it'll be a way to kind of describe myself to Juliette, she can get to know me a bit better, but also it felt like part of the project. That was part of the project that would be in the final piece. So I took her down St Stephen Street, which was where I got my first job as a teenager as a shop assistant for Miss Selfridge when it existed. It doesn't exist anymore. And then walked into the more historical part of Norwich, past the market, which is a very, very lively part of the city. It really is the hub, and it contains lots of amazing stalls now that serve food and some wonderful things. But in my childhood, it was quite grotty and very old and needed a revamp, which it has had subsequently. So I carried on that path, and my intention then was to walk down to the cathedral, which is where there is a statue of Julian of Norwich, which I wanted to show Juliette. And so the story really encompasses different strands of history. There's the medieval history of the city. There's a history as I knew it as a teenager and as a child, and there's the history that I'm kind of learning to recognise myself, so the present time as well. And the more Juliette and I exchanged messages, and the more we talked about what we were doing in each other's cities, it became clear that we were kind of doing similar activities. And so that felt right to me. That felt like that was an endorsement of the process. So really the story is a way to kind of encompass all those routes, the routes I took, but also the conversations that we had with one another. So that's what I wrote in the end.
It really felt that way as a reader, like you mentioned, Megan, that you're taking us on a tour. You're trying to look at the city in a new way. And it also piqued my curiosity with street names like Rampant Horse Street and Gentleman's Walk. And just that idea of a lot of people have that connection to space where they think that's where I met my husband before he was her husband, as you put it. And you mentioned that the location where you bring us so that we can see Julian of Norwich, and you describe the mystic's plain face is bathed in light. So you take us on a journey in this text revelation. And I'm wondering, Juliette, what was it like to be taken on this trip as a reader, but also as this part of this exchange? What stood out to you as you were being encouraged to visit this new location virtually?
J'ai l'impression que ce que j'ai beaucoup retenu de tout ça, c'est notre façon de vouloir raconter la ville à l'autre, chacune à notre façon. Donc, à chaque fois que j'avais, par exemple, des bribes de ce que Megan écrivait, on fonctionnait par WhatsApp. Donc, des fois, on recevait un peu comme un texto, on reçoit des photos. Puis, c'est comme si à chaque fois, je me demandais, à chaque fois que je vais dans le Vieux-Québec, qu'est-ce que je pourrais lui envoyer? Qu'est-ce qui pourrait contribuer à la correspondance finalement. Parce que c'était vraiment ça qui se passait aussi, là. C'était vraiment une correspondance. C'était donc à chaque bribe qu'elle m'envoyait, des façons dont elle me racontait la ville, ben je pouvais me demander moi à mon tour qu'est-ce que je pourrais lui envoyer pour que ça fonctionne, tu sais. Donc, ça, j'ai trouvé ça particulièrement intéressant, c'est cette façon-là de pouvoir vraiment avoir une correspondance en temps réel avec quelqu'un qui ne connaît pas la ville. C'est quand même c'est impressionnant aussi, là, tu sais. Moi non plus, je connaissais pas Norwich, donc je savais pas j'avais mon impression de ce que c'était. J'avais l'impression de comment Megan m'expliquait la ville. Puis personnellement, moi, j'étais comme très curieuse, puis j'avais vraiment envie de. Puis je sais, Megan aussi, tu sais, on sentait qu'on avait vraiment une curiosité pour la ville de l'autre. Puis il y avait aussi cette notion-là de se dire, ah, tu sais, comment je peux visiter la ville autrement? Donc moi, j'allais sur YouTube, j'allais chercher des tours de la ville pour voir comment on pouvait explorer chacune à notre façon, puis me dire, ah, tu sais, telle rue, je l'ai vue, elle ressemble à telle rue à Québec. Donc, tu sais, essayer de faire des comparatifs parce qu'il y a quand même, il y a quelque chose de, les comparaisons peuvent être assez faciles dans nos deux villes. J'ai l'impression, on a quand même, comment j'ai voulu l'amener dans mon texte aussi, c'est qu'on sent quand même qu'il y a une mise en comparaison des deux villes, puis une similarité entre les deux aussi. Donc c'est comme ça que j'ai trouvé que j'ai aimé comme vraiment correspondre comme ça, puis savoir que chacune nous raconte notre ville, chacune raconte sa propre ville à l'autre. Ça l'amène encore une fois quelque chose de tellement différent parce que je suis pas née à Québec, Québec, mais depuis le temps que j'habite ici, ben, tu le vois différemment quand tu le comptes à quelqu'un d'autre. Tu sais. Donc, c'est ça qui est intéressant, je trouvais, dans cette correspondance-là.
And even I would say, as someone who has lived in this city since 2008, which was the year that Quebec really underlined its historic significance. It was the 400th anniversary of the founding of Quebec City in 2008. And I would say, even as a reader from Quebec City, your text, Comme des Flammes, really invited me to look at my city a little bit differently. I want to pivot briefly. We're going to come back to place because place and location is so important in your texts, and it's really wonderful to be taken on these journeys. But I want to talk about the historical figures who popped out for you as you were doing this research and the places that are named after them. Megan, can you tell us a little bit about Julian of Norwich?
Well, Julian of Norwich, who I realise, looking back through my history of living here, has kind of haunted me throughout my life. That you know, the name is here. There's the St Julian's Church, which actually, if I could see through this building next to me, I could see it's like a 30-second walk from this location, which is fun. But I'm ashamed to say I've never known much about her. I hadn't before this project read her book, and this was another opportunity to kind of frequent the place where I live through her. So I had the privilege of meeting Sally Ann Lomas, who's an expert on Julian of Norwich and a writer, local writer. That's the historian I reference in the story. We met at the cathedral, which is where there's a statue dedicated to her, and actually the cathedral would have been a building that she would have frequented as a person. There's not an awful lot known about her life before she became an anchorite in her middle age. But what we do know is that there are locations in Norwich that she would have been familiar with. So when I started the tour with Sally Ann, we started there and we walked along some of the locations of historical sites. For example, Elm Hill is another historically preserved street in Norwich, where you can see a lot of the architecture that would have been present when Julian was alive in the 14th century. And we walked through the city and we came to St Julian's Church, which was where she was an anchorite, which was walled up in a cell by choice, I should say, for about 30 years of her life. The church was rebuilt, having been bombed in the Second World War, so it's not an exact the exact same architecture. But the cell has been rebuilt with a mind to creating a similar feel as she would have understood it. And this was a church I'd never visited before, so I've never been there. And so it was really special actually going there with Sally Ann, who had all this knowledge of Julian of Norwich, and then talking about, in fact, what we did, we discussed her, and we discussed the intimacy of her text, which really communicates, this is something Sally Ann talked about, there's an intimacy that she expresses, which is part of the reason why she's so popular with lots of people of different denominations. And it's quite a rare thing for someone at that time to write so personally about their interaction, with God and their relationship with God. And that really interested me in terms of this project, because everything that seemed to come out between our exchanges with Juliette is the idea of communication and correspondence, particularly between women, and what is made from that, and the purpose that has. And so coming to St Julian's Church was really interesting, and it gave a real insight into what kind of atmosphere, I guess, she would have experienced even so long ago, because the infrastructure around the church, obviously there's lots of buildings and it has changed, but the river is still there, so there's still it's not as busy as she would have known it, but there's still kind of a sort of an underground feel to this part of the city. There's lots of hullabaloo at the weekends. There's lots of sort of party atmosphere and things. And by the river, in her period, she would have known it very lively as well. And so it's really interesting to look at the city in a new way and kind of think, well, actually, there are parts of Norwich that still retain the same, if not function, but atmosphere and purpose, if you would have known it. So, so this was very exciting to me. And then to pass on, you know, the sort of physical proof of Julian of Norwich to Juliette, and then have Juliette tell me the research that she'd done from her position in Quebec was really wonderful. And it was like this kind of feeling of the knowledge of this woman and the product of her kind of creativity in writing of this text has kind of spread over, well, it's spread over the whole world because it's so influential, but particularly in this exchange between the two of us, it kind of formed itself. So she haunts the story, but there's a lot more now to me walking around the city, and I think of her as I'm walking around the particularly old parts of Norwich. And I think part of the mystery, part of the reason why she's so interesting to think about is because we don't know that much about her early life. There's a novel being published, or I think it might have just recently come out by Victoria Mackenzie, who Juliette and I had the privilege of speaking to during the research. And she has written about the relationship between Julian of Norwich and Marjorie Kemp, which gives a lot of emphasis on kind of a supposed fictional part that Julian might have had. But there's something quite intriguing about that idea of a kind of a history. She's a historical figure, but her own history actually is still kind of mysterious. And in terms of women's lives, I think that's quite an important aspect of women's history. And I think everyone personally kind of feels it to some degree of thinking about who they are as a woman in the world and what parts of their history is actually important in a social, you know, big historical way. So there's all those thoughts whirling around my head, and that's what we talked a lot about those kinds of things in our discussions.
Such thoughtful reflections, Megan. Thank you, and really an invitation to the reader to learn more. It really whets your appetite. You want to know more. I was just writing down the name of the author you mentioned for the book that's coming out, because once you start learning a little bit about the history of these women that we've maybe never heard of before, it's a great opportunity to delve deeper. And that leads me to Marie de l'Incarnation, whose name I have heard since I lived here. I knew she was a nun. I know that there's a street named after her, and I think of it more as an intersection than as the history of a woman who lived in Quebec. And even though there are centuries that separate Julian of Norwich and Marie de l'Incarnation, you two both were able to find some parallels in your writing. Juliette, I'd like to invite you to tell us a little bit about what you've learned about Marie de l'Incarnation and the significance of her life and what it means here in Quebec City.
Ben, ce que j'ai trouvé surtout très intéressant par rapport à ce que tu disais, Julia, c'était l'idée d'invitation à découvrir, parce que je pense que c'était Julian of Norwich et Marie de l'Incarnation étaient un peu les figures de base de ma recherche. En fait, là, c'était vraiment, j'avais déposé ce projet-là pour la résidence. Puis là, après ça, ben, je me suis questionnée à savoir comment ça allait s'intégrer dans mon texte et dans mes deux textes, enfin. Puis en découvrant Julian of Norwich, j'ai découvert des aspects de Marie de l'Incarnation que je ne connaissais pas ou peu. Donc, pour faire ça court, Marie de l'Incarnation, en fait, elle est arrivée de Tours sur un des premiers bateaux là, en Nouvelle-France, entre autres avec des Augustines, mais elle était du monastère des Ursulines. Donc c'était vraiment... elle est arrivée à Québec pour éduquer les jeunes filles. C'est comme ça qu'on l'a dit. Donc, elle a fondé le monastère des Ursulines, qui est encore présentement une école qui est ouverte encore aujourd'hui. Puis, moi, ce qui m'intéressait beaucoup dans la figure de Marie Guyard, Marie de l'Incarnation, c'était, en fait, elle est considérée comme l'autrice des premières mentions en français. Donc, l'idée du français versus le latin. Donc, elle écrivait pas en latin, elle écrivait en français. Puis c'est ça qui m'intéressait, c'était l'idée de découvrir deux figures qui ont été les premières de leur, je dirais, génération à écrire dans leur langue. Donc, Julian of Norwich a été connue comme étant la première femme ayant écrit en anglais et Marie de l'Incarnation, la première femme ayant écrit en français. Donc, je trouvais ça intéressant d'explorer ces deux figures-là un peu côte à côte, malgré la centaine d'années qui les séparent, parce que c'est quand même intéressant aussi de faire ce parallèle-là entre, je dirais, l'Europe et l'Amérique. Donc, c'est vraiment l'idée de se dire, il y a quand même un gros écart qui sépare, l'histoire des deux continents. Mais il y a quand même cette idée-là de faire des rapprochements. Je pense que j'aime beaucoup aussi créer ces rapprochements-là, même un peu les forcer pour finalement qu'on en vienne à découvrir autre chose ou à essayer de dialoguer deux époques ensemble. Ça, c'est quelque chose qui m'intéresse beaucoup dans ma démarche. Donc, voilà, moi, je pense qu'il faut découvrir Marie de l'Incarnation. C'est une figure extrêmement intéressante. Puis, il y a aussi l'idée euh, comme on se parlait tout à l'heure, Julia, l'idée des buildings ou des bâtiments qui sont nommés après des grandes femmes. Il y en a très peu dans la ville de Québec. Puis ici, ben, il y a l'édifice Marie-Guyard qui est le complexe G, qu'on connaît de ce nom-là. On ne le connaît pas sur le nom de l'édifice Marie-Guyard. Je trouve ça très intéressant de se dire, OK, la plus haute tour, une des plus hautes tours à Québec, est nommée en l'honneur de Marie de l'Incarnation. Donc, c'est assez drôle, je trouve, comme anecdote. Là.
And I will also emphasize the fact that Marie d'Incarnation is a name you see in a lot of places, but I did not realize that her name was Marie Guyard. And I remember the first time someone told me that the Complexe G was named after a woman, because we were talking about the names of places. And Megan, here in Quebec, we have bridges named after mostly, I'll be blunt, dead white male politicians for the most part, political figures, like premiers. Even in the weeks after they die, there's a street named after Parisot or other figures. So that kind of brings me to a conversation about how feminism plays into your writing practice and how we see that expressed in the different tours that we take. Megan, at one point you do mention the historian kind of challenging stereotypes of what we might imagine what Julian of Norwich's life would have been at the time. And you say at one point, it's a common mistake to think she was isolated. And Juliette as well, we think of these nuns as these people that have a religious devotion to God that takes up all the space in their life. And maybe they won't devote time to being pioneers, to being some of the first to create writing in these cities that are today cities of literature by UNESCO. Megan, I'll start with you. Can you tell us about some of the different ways, what surprised you about Julian, and did you encounter kind of sexist perceptions at times?
Oh yeah, no, I think that's key to it all. I mean, I think anyone, well, it's certainly true of my understanding of religious life of any era, whether it's contemporary or historical, that there's a certain air of obviously reverence and separation and sort of piousness, preciousness, perhaps as well. And so I thought it was fantastic to learn actually the life of an anchorite walled up in their cell was not a life of isolation, although they're kind of on the sort of fringes of society in terms of a physical space. They're not necessarily roaming the city, although I believe some of them did. It depends what the kind of individual arrangements were. But when I found out that actually in this cell, and the St. Julian's Church has reproduced the kind of windows and openings into the cell as she would have known it. But you go into the room and there's a window directly into the nave of the church, so that she would have had access to the sermons, the daily mass and daily sermons from the priest. And then there was another door which dealt with the area where she would have had, I guess, washing facilities and places to put food and take food. But then there's also a window directly out onto the street, so that people can come and seek her advice and speak to her about all kinds of things. And I didn't realize, I've kind of known, fuzzy way what anchorites were and what they did. But to me, it felt, I assumed it was about separation and isolation, perhaps almost like kind of like a way to obtain a meditative state in a communication with God, that it's quiet and it's, it's pious. And the idea that it would have involved, raucous, conversations with everyone. And as I said, we're located right by the river, so you can imagine all, the sorts of people would be coming and going. And that was true of most religious orders. It's a communication actually with the public in a way. And so the idea, I think this is often the case, and certainly in writing circles, when we talk about what kind of writing is prized and what kind of creative spaces are those that are prized, there is this kind of feeling that writing is done in a separate place. It's removed from society. It's not part of kind of a family hub. And so I loved learning about this, but as a relatively recent mother, I've got two children, a 5-year-old and a 1-year-old, and have had to navigate how to write in a busy household. How do you balance all this? You can't remove yourself into this pristine tower and do your very important work in this very kind of male way. It has to be all involved. And so I love the idea. What's most surprising to me is that is the connection with the divine, if you're going to talk about it that way, is through ordinary domestic, the detail of life, about what it is to be human. And I think this is from talking to Sally Ann Lomas, this is one of the things that we talked about, is that it's in this sort of personal and slightly sort of autobiographical way of writing that I think women for centuries have been told this isn't serious writing, domestic writing isn't serious, it's not political. But of course that's complete nonsense. And writers like Annie Ernaux, who's someone that Juliette and I talked a lot about during this conversation. In fact, we found out that we'd both been having conversations about Annie Ernaux separately with other people the same week. It was really uncanny. But her writing, completely shows that, it's the political in the personal, and also in the fragmentary and the episodic, and in writing, which is about echo and rhythm. I feel that's there is a feminist. It's about women's lives. Women's lives generally are complicated and mixed up, and there isn't this kind of pious division of labour. You do it all at once, and so that was quite a personal kind of angle to be coming at this project from. But then to discover that actually Julian's life would be largely similar. That she is this kind of separated woman, but in being so, she's actually mixed up in a service to society through having this direct contact with the public and being there for them, was a wonderful thing to discover. So, but to me, it also fed into this project. This project is it's not just a residency; it's an exchange. It's an exchange, and so to me, that fed directly into the way that Juliette and I were working together, and the sorts of material that we were sharing with one another. And that's what I was trying to get across in my writing, but Juliette has it in hers too. So that was really interesting.
That's fascinating. There's so much in what you just expressed, Megan. And I was thinking when you mentioned being a new mother and that idea of like separating yourself from a role as parent to a role as writer, there is no clear delineation. But it also reminded me of when I was reading Juliette's piece, when she references Virginia Woolf and talking, of course, about Virginia Woolf and A Room of One's Own, and whether or not that is even an achievable thing. But you also talked about silence and sound a lot, and the river. And that brings me to Juliette. And I'm wondering how much you learned. We have, of course, the Fleuve Saint-Laurent. We have the St. Lawrence River here in Quebec City that is incredibly important, but there are some smaller rivers that are quite significant as well, including the river Akiawenahak, which is the Huron-Wendat name for what most people in Quebec City call La Rivière Saint-Charles. So I was wondering, Juliette, if you could tell us a bit about the river Akiawenahak.
Oui, donc ce que j'ai trouvé vraiment intéressant, c'est l'idée de... Parce qu'en fait, cette pièce-là, de Petite rivière que j'ai écrite, c'est en lien avec une fois où Megan et moi, on a discuté de nos prochains écrits. Puis on se demandait qu'est-ce qu'on pourrait faire d'intéressant pour l'une pour l'autre. Donc, on s'était dit qu'on allait essayer de trouver une historienne qui allait pouvoir nous guider et nous faire visiter la ville, notre propre ville finalement, puis qu'on allait écrire une pièce par rapport à ça. Donc, qu'on allait écrire un texte sur notre expérience avec l'historienne, donc un peu une entrée dans la ville plus claire, là, plus concrète que par notre texte plus principal. Donc, ça a été, moi j'ai rencontré Sophie Imbeau, qui est une historienne de la Ville de Québec. Puis, je l'avais guidée un peu. J'avais dit, moi, j'aimerais ça qu'on parle, par exemple, des fortifications, qu'on parle de la ville fortifiée, donc le Vieux-Québec, qu'on parle aussi bon, du fleuve, de l'importance du fleuve dans la façon de voir la ville. Puis, l'une des premières choses qu'elle m'a dites, c'est l'importance de la rivière Saint-Charles. Fait que là, moi, je suis à Limoilou en ce moment, j'habite à Limoilou, je passe la rivière Saint-Charles à tous les jours, 2 fois par jour. Puis là, après ça, voir l'importance de cette rivière-là dans la conquête, entre autres, comment les gens, en fait, Montcalm pensait que les Anglais allaient arriver par la rivière Saint-Charles. Ce qui est tellement drôle à penser parce que tu te dis, ben, tu sais, c'est quand même une petite rivière, c'est pas quelque chose d'immense, c'est pas le fleuve Saint-Laurent, c'est pas. Puis après ça, moi, c'est ça qui m'a fascinée dans ça, c'est que j'ai redécouvert cette rivière-là que je traverse à tous les jours. Donc, ce que je trouvais intéressant, c'était aussi de passer par ben, d'où elle vient. Donc, c'est la rivière Saint-Charles, mais elle provient du lac Saint-Charles. Puis, de tout voir un peu d'où elle passe. Donc, vraiment, Wendake, toutes les chutes qui sont des chutes magnifiques, puis qu'on dirait qu'on oublie un peu parce que quand on la voit à Limoilou, la rivière, ben, on a l'impression que elle est un peu sèche, elle est un peu triste parfois. Puis c'était ça qui m'intéressait je pense que dans ma démarche d'écriture, j'ai aussi ce souci-là de redécouvrir des choses, de me dire, bon, mais ça, je le pense d'une certaine façon, puis finalement, ben, on m'a fait voir autrement. Fait que là, je pense que l'idée de la rivière, ça a été quand même tournant pour moi mon rapport avec l'historienne, ça a été de constater qu'il y a tellement de choses tout change, tout est mouvement. Puis là, vient je dirais, les citations de Virginia Woolf que j'ai citées. Donc, cette idée-là d'écrire sur le mouvement, d'écrire sur le temps qui passe, mais aussi sur la façon de se questionner, la façon de changer d'idée, ça, c'était super important pour moi.
And of course, the quote that you have from Virginia Woolf in your text is from The Waves, Les Vagues. So, of course, that evokes water. But it really is quite remarkable to think about the importance of the St. Charles River. And like you say, we forget about les chutes Kabirkuna. When we talk about waterfalls in Quebec City, we always talk about driving about 20 minutes away to see les chutes Montmorency, which are beautiful and remarkable and important in their own way. But it is really fascinating to delve deeper into which stories we know, what about the geography of our city has changed. It took me on a journey in my own city and in my own neighborhood. So thank you again, Juliette, for writing in that way. I want to talk briefly about the writing practice and how this exchange of images, of texts, of writing, in formal and informal contexts, how it has informed your writing practice and what kind of lasting legacy you think having this virtual exchange residency with someone in another city that has a lot of echoes. Megan, let's start with you.
Oh, it's been really amazing. I as I mentioned earlier, been working on my second novel for a very long time now, and it's a project that spans the kind of end writing of my previous novel, then the birth of and the raising of 2 young children. So now it's a very different project than it was when I began. So this project being kind of long enough to really kind of get into something, being 3 months, but also short enough to see the beginning, middle, and end in in one gasp, so to speak, rather than it was really great. So it was really intense, and what I enjoyed particularly about it was having having the initial proposal. So obviously I went into this with a particular idea, but it was obvious from the beginning that we would both have to be quite flexible with what it was that ended up coming out, because obviously it's an exchange, we don't know quite how it's going to work. And so it was quite clear from the beginning that was part, kind of sort of the extra ingredient that would have to be made room for. And I really enjoyed that aspect of it, and also so using kind of the structure of the proposal as kind of an initial kind of frame for it. But then the more we spoke with one another, the more walks we did, the more photos we exchanged. And I think we were both quite relaxed about sharing kind of early draft passages. And there was lots in Juliette's writing, which is still is in the finished piece, which is wonderful. So there was lots of back and forth. There's one detail in there about this idea of having kind of crossed the river and walked a fair way to go to a bar, and why did I do that when the best bar is around the corner? And that to me really informed the whole exchange, because this is exactly, you know, what these exchanges are about and why they're important. They're important because you learn about another culture and another city, but obviously there's that element of how it changes your own perception of your own city and your own life. And so having Juliette write that again was sort of confirmation that the process that we were kind of going through was working. So I've really enjoyed being quite active in trying to incorporate the method of the correspondence in the actual finished piece. And this is something that I generally am quite keen to do, but haven't really had the opportunity before. And so for me, what it's really made me think about is to spend perhaps a bit more time putting those parameters in place to begin with, and to think about process and to think about what a project is for, not just for the content, but the way it comes about, because that to me really influences the outcome. I would love to do this exchange with other writers in other places, I think, because the principle is there, and obviously the material will be different every time. And so I love that idea. And this is why UNESCO is such a great organization for that, because it encourages these thoughts to sort of take place. I also feel happy at how kind of unprecious I have been about sort of the writing and sharing kind of rough writing. And I feel sort of like I should pat myself on the back for that. But also for Juliette as well, because it's quite, you know, it's quite a daunting thing. You don't know the other person involved, you know, in the project or how it's going to be. But I feel that openness in the early stages is really important. And then there's a point, I think, in any project where you hunker down and you take what you have and you have to be quite solitary, and you piece it together and you work it out. But I think having the openness to begin with is really interesting. So that's something I'm going to be certainly taking to other projects. And also the fact of using environments which are more accessible to me is certainly something I'll be doing. To date, all of my projects have been really about foreign places. My first novel was about New York City. My second one is largely, it's set in the American West. So these are all locations that clearly are very difficult for me to visit, and certainly now. And so I've learned from this, actually, you can apply that same creative vision or ambition to local places. Why not? And it's funny that I've never really tried to do this before. So yeah, so it's changed a lot really about how I might approach projects in the future. And it opens up lots of exciting possibilities for collaboration and exchange, which is something I want to do more of, certainly.
Thank you. And Juliette, before I ask you the same question about how this has affected your creative writing process, Megan evoked the bar scene from your piece, Comme des Flammes. I have it in front of me here. I could read part of it if you don't have it handy in front of you, Juliette.
Oui, tu peux y aller.
OK. J'ai marché un temps pour trouver ce peu. Après avoir esquivé les touristes qui déambulent par dizaines sur les rues étroites, longeant les pavés et les cul-de-sac, je me suis assise pour boire une pinte dans ce sous-sol de pierre. Lorsque j'avais 18 ans, pourtant, nous venions fréquemment ici après une longue soirée à boire entre amis de l'autre côté du fleuve. Ces rues touristiques étaient désertes après le dernier traversier. Nous venions prendre une ultime pinte au Pape Georges ou chez l'oncle Antoine avant de remonter vers la Haute-Ville. J'avais 18 ans et l'impression de vivre dans un décor de film. I think a lot of people who have gone out for a pint in Quebec City can relate to that. The last ferry between Quebec and Lévis means that you have a timeline. You have to stop drinking. You have to catch that ferry if you want to sleep in your own bed tonight. But just how evocative the imagery that you write there, where you see those crowds of tourists, you see the kind of crowded sidewalks and people not being very aware of how much space they're taking up. How has this exchange and this writing residency, has it made place more present in your work? Has it had an influence?
Oui, c'est sûr que oui. Je pense que ça a donné une raison aussi d'écrire, dans le sens que j'avais l'impression que je devais rendre des comptes à Megan, mais en même temps, des beaux comptes, là, tu sais, je me disais, je pense qu'il y avait quand même une idée de vouloir la rejoindre, puis de vouloir rejoindre avec davantage de d'éléments qui pouvaient nous faire parler, nous faire discuter, nous faire correspondre ensemble. Donc, je pense que ça a été un très gros point positif pour moi parce que je vais toujours, finalement, je vais toujours l'avoir en tête. Je pense que je vais toujours rester avec l'idée de, ah, Megan aimerait telle chose. Je sais qu'elle avait une affection particulière pour, par exemple, une ville historique, mais avec beaucoup de trucs de construction autour, là, tu sais, un peu des constructions un peu ostentatoires autour de fortifications super anciennes. Puis là, j'essayais d'y prendre ça en photo parce que je savais qu'elle aimait ça. Puis ça, je trouve que c'est intéressant, développer ce lien d'amitié-là, finalement, par l'écriture. Je trouve ça vraiment magique. Puis je trouve que ça a été particulier, je pense, ensemble, parce qu'on avait vraiment des démarches d'écriture qui se rejoignaient, des thèmes qui se rejoignaient. On avait envie de parler de la même chose. Puis je pense qu'il y a ça aussi qui nous a vraiment rejoints dès le début. Puis je dirais aussi que je réponds la même chose que Megan. Moi aussi, je me, je me trouve bonne d'avoir échangé aussi rapidement des petits bouts de texte que je sentais qui étaient pas finis du tout, mais je sentais qu'ils allaient donner un peu d'eau au moulin. Puis moi, j'ai cette tendance-là d'un peu être très secrète puis de pas vraiment montrer ce que j'écris jusqu'à ce que ce soit fini puis que les gens disent, mais comment quand est-ce que tu as écrit ça? On sait pas trop comment tu as écrit ça, mais on dirait que j'aime ça, développer ça un peu davantage, de me dire, ben, c'est pas grave, c'est pas, si j'ai pas trop travaillé dessus, je pense que ça peut juste permettre de faire évoluer la chose, tu sais. Donc, ouais, je suis d'accord que c'est sûr que ça a aidé, là.
Thank you, Juliette. I have one last question for you two that we can't not talk about. The fact that both Quebec City and Norwich have been fortified cities and have these walls. And Megan, I'm thinking particularly of your conclusion in your reflection on what this kind of exchange has been like. You describe saying, I feel creatively refreshed as one who's taking an extended foreign trip. And as I wrote, the fortifications weakened, stones in the wall fell, and Juliette and her mystic stepped through. Juliette, I'm going to start with you. How did you feel when you first read that?
Ah, c'est tellement beau, c'est tellement précieux de lire des choses comme ça, on dirait. Puis c'est des bouts aussi qu'elle ne m'avait pas fait lire. Elle m'a fait lire beaucoup de fragments qui étaient fictionnels, qui étaient liés à un de ces deux textes. Puis je trouve que ça a été, ça a été tellement beau de voir et de constater qu'on a vécu une expérience similaire, tu sais. De se dire, tu sais, j'ai pas, ça n'a pas été plus important pour moi que pour elle, tu sais. J'ai senti que ça avait la même importance. Puis ça, ben, c'est vraiment précieux parce que on peut pas savoir avant d'entrer puis avant de se commettre un peu. Donc, je trouvais ça vraiment beau et magnifique. Ça m'a fait j'ai versé une petite larme.
It's very moving to read. Even as someone from the outside, I found it just quite, there's a lot of affection in this exchange. And even that idea of a pen pal, the kind of childlike state we can be in when we're writing to a stranger, and how much do we want to share about ourselves, and how quickly do we get to know each other. Megan, how about on your end? How did you feel about that idea of walls coming down? Which was the title you chose as well.
Yeah, well, it all kind of is informed by all of it, really. There's the premise. I mean, my proposal at the beginning was to look at Quebec and Norwich regarding the fortifications in both cities. But my kind of thematic way in was really like what are the walls within ourselves, I guess. What are the things we like to remember, don't like to remember? What do we stop ourselves doing? What are the reasons why we don't do certain things? And as we were, all these other parts of the historical exchange and the research was being exchanged in the way that it was, I really loved that idea. And we talked a lot about between us how the fortifications were different in both cities. So in Norwich, it's largely ruinous. So the city walls, beside the ring road, that there are parts of it which are very beautiful, parts of it which are just like filled with like rubbish and stuff. And it's kind of, I quite like that it's sort of a bit decrepit, and it's where teenagers smoke and do all sorts of things. Whereas in Quebec, as Juliette said, it's so pristine. It's continually repaired and restored, and I like this idea. It made me think about then what the walls were originally for, and they were they're there to keep people out or people in. They're barriers for a very particular reason. But here we are talking to one another in different countries about certain things and sharing things in a way which is intimate, as we've already talked. These are like first draft passages. These are photographs from our personal lives. We were reaching over those walls. We were kind of having, being done with the walls and saying no. But also in the way that we were talking about women's writing, Julian's writing, but also the writing of Annie Ernaux, but also in the fragments that Juliette was giving me about Quebec and the way that she writes about herself in the city, in the history, and how it's all kind of wrapped up. But yet the style of it is also fragmentary, as mine is, which was not something that, we've not planned this. This is just how we both write. And so to me, the idea of kind of walls and the gaps in walls and what comes through in those gaps seemed really important. So it all kind of worked that way. And in the story, I talk a bit about Norwich Castle, which is one of the locations I got to visit. And at the moment, they're going through a renovation project, which is a very big project. They're reinstating kind of an original floor in the castle keep and updating the shop and cafe and things. And so I got to see behind the scenes. I got to go into the keep. They've got all the scaffolding up. It's absolutely incredible. They're very generous with their time. And for me, as a location, the castle is a very personal place. It's somewhere I've known as a child. There are lots of exhibits still that are the same stuffed birds that I remember seeing as a child. But this like kind of idea of a historic site kind of rediscovering itself, rediscovering its origins, and that there was so much information that I could have put in, which I didn't really have space for. That Tim Pestle, the chief archaeologist, was talking about how, they were reinstating walls that existed. They're not making the walls up. They're putting them in the kind of shadows, the footprints of the walls that were there. But as a child, running around, the balcony inside this keep, these are just like bits of brick that I've known as kind of ruinous. And so for me, I felt quite sort of emotionally torn with the idea of they're going to be repairing and changing this kind of memory of this place I have. But to me, it was kind of the whole process of this residency and talking about what the purpose of kind of the benefits of change and how we remember things and what that means. And then, how the castle is finding new life for itself in the future. Like all of these things are connected, and it is quite miraculous, I think, in any project where that begins to happen, where suddenly there are elements of it that connect in ways you weren't expecting. And to me, it's kind of like a validation. So the more open I was about all of this, the better the ideas were and the kind of more intimate the exchange became. And so that's what I went with. And so it was, it's kind of probably the most heartfelt piece I've ever written, actually, the story and the essay. It feels very personal for all those reasons. And this is why I say that the idea of coming to new projects with a similar openness, however that might come about, I think is going to be really important. So yeah, I feel very grateful for it.
Thank you, Megan. You do say that in Walls Fall Down, that this is not something that you've ever felt comfortable doing. So it's really great to hear you pushed out of your comfort zone, but in a really positive way. and as gently as possible. Thank you both for joining us, telling us about your residency and about how you came to write together and separately. Thank you both for your time, and congratulations on these pieces of writing.
Thank you.
Thank you. Merci.